For centuries, the Catholic Church has been one of the most powerful institutions on earth. Kingdoms rose and fell with papal approval. Wars were declared in the name of faith. Information was controlled, preserved, and sometimes buried. Deep beneath Vatican City lies the archive. 53 miles of shelving, documents spanning 12 centuries, letters from Michelangelo, papal bulls that changed empires, records of trials, excommunications, and diplomatic correspondence. In 2019, Pope Francis announced a partial opening of the archives. Researchers would gain access to materials previously restricted. Transparency, he said. Historical accountability. Hundreds of scholars applied for access. Most were approved. They found gaps, entire sections missing, documents referenced in catalogs but absent from shelves, correspondence that should exist but doesn't, and in the deepest vaults, files still marked forbidden, sealed by papal decree, inaccessible even under the new policy. But what if that's not the full story? According to a former Vatican archivist who spoke to a religious history journal under condition of anonymity, the 2019 opening was carefully curated. Months before researchers arrived, certain materials were relocated, not destroyed, moved to sections that remain classified, deep storage areas that don't appear on any official floor plan. We received lists, the archivist said, documents that needed to be secured before access was granted. The lists included entire collections, papal correspondence from specific periods, records related to certain historical events, files that, according to the catalog system, should have been available. When scholars requested them, we were instructed to say they were undergoing preservation or that they'd been misfiled and couldn't be located. But he'd seen them, touched them, moved them himself to the restricted vaults. One collection in particular stood out: astronomical observations from the Vatican Observatory, spanning several centuries, charts, calculations, measurements of celestial events. The strange part was the gaps, he said, years missing, decades where we should have continuous records but don't. When he asked about it, his supervisor told him those records had been lost to water damage. But the archivist had seen the inventory logs. The documents existed. They'd been cataloged. Then, at some point, they were moved to a section he didn't have clearance to access. A historian who gained access during the 2019 opening described her experience researching Templar records. Barbara Frail is her name. She'd spent years studying the Knights Templar, their trial, their suppression, the charges against them. She requested documents related to Pope Clement V's investigation of the order, files that should contain testimony, evidence, papal correspondence about the decision to dissolve the Templars. Some materials were provided, fragments, partial transcripts, but crucial documents were missing. The testimony from the Paris hearings, Frail said in an interview. Complete sections absent. We have the verdicts, but not the evidence that led to them. She was told those sections had deteriorated beyond recovery. But catalog entries from decades earlier described those exact documents in detail. Researchers who'd seen them in the past left notes about their contents. Then, sometime before the modern opening, they vanished. Not deteriorated, removed. A Vatican official who worked in document preservation, he requested his name not be used, described the multi-level classification system. Most people think the secret archives are either open or closed, binary. In reality, there are tiers. Materials available to approved researchers. Materials available only to senior church historians. Materials accessible only with explicit papal permission, and then materials that require permission from multiple cardinals, granted only for specific purposes. Beyond that, he said, there are documents that simply don't exist in any accessible catalog. Files stored in vaults beneath the main archive, rooms that appear on old building plans but not on current ones, collections known only through whispered institutional memory. "I saw a list once," he said. "Documents marked reserved to His Holiness. Not even cardinals could access them without direct papal authorization." The list included astronomical records, correspondence with certain historical figures, and records from the Inquisition that don't appear in the official Inquisition archive. When I asked what made them so sensitive, I was told some truths serve no purpose. The official catalog of the Vatican Archives lists holdings by period, subject, and collection. Papal correspondence, diplomatic records, administrative documents, everything indexed, cross-referenced, theoretically retrievable. But researchers who've worked extensively in the archives notice patterns, gaps in chronology, letters referencing correspondence that isn't in the collection, documents cited in later materials but absent from the archive itself. For those who remember when the Pentagon Papers revealed decades of classified lies, these gaps feel familiar. One notable absence: complete records from the Vatican's relationship with Nazi Germany. Some documents were released, diplomatic cables, official statements, but private correspondence between Pope Pius XII and German officials remains largely sealed. Vatican officials cite privacy concerns, ongoing historical sensitivity that need to protect individuals whose families still live. But Pius XII died over 60 years ago. The Reich collapsed 80 years ago. At what point does historical documentation outweigh sensitivity? The same pattern appears in records related to the Crusades. We have papal bulls calling for holy war, records of taxation to fund campaigns, but detailed correspondence about strategy, about negotiations with Muslim leaders, about what actually happened in certain sieges. Those sections are incomplete. Documents obtained through decades of requests from various national archives reference Vatican communications that aren't in the Vatican archive. Letters sent but never received, or received but never preserved, or preserved but hidden. The Templar dissolution is another example. The order was wealthy, powerful, connected to nobility across Europe. Their sudden suppression generated mountains of documentation, trials, property seizures, testimony under torture. Some records exist, others are referenced but missing. Entire categories of documents, financial records showing where Templar wealth went after dissolution, for instance, simply aren't available. The part they didn't put in textbooks. Even the 2019 opening had restrictions. Researchers needed specific justifications. Certain collections required additional permissions. Some materials could be viewed but not photographed. Others could be accessed only in the presence of an archivist. And the deeper vaults, the ones holding materials marked forbidden, remained completely sealed. Vatican officials explain this as necessary protection, fragile documents, privacy considerations, materials too sensitive for general research. But other archives worldwide manage to balance preservation with access. The Vatican's restrictions seem uniquely absolute, uniquely opaque. It's not that they're protecting historical documents, it's that they're protecting what those documents reveal. The archive itself is vast. 53 miles of shelving spread across multiple buildings and underground chambers, some sections climate-controlled, others in older vaults where temperature and humidity fluctuate, but the architecture tells a story. The main archive building dates back centuries. Successive popes expanded it, added vaults, created new storage areas. Some additions appear on architectural plans, others don't. A blueprint from the early 20th century shows the archive's layout: chambers, corridors, storage rooms. A researcher comparing that blueprint to the current layout found discrepancies. Rooms that existed then but aren't accessible now. Corridors that should connect sections but dead end into walls. Spaces that should be there but aren't. Construction doesn't erase space, it repurposes it.
So where did those rooms go? Photographs of the archive show endless rows of wooden shelving, documents bound in leather and vellum, manuscripts illuminated in gold leaf, the atmosphere of accumulated centuries. But look closely at certain images, shadows that suggest passages behind shelving, walls that seem thinner than they should be, architectural features that hint at concealed entrances. The Vatican doesn't allow unrestricted photography in the archives. Researchers can request images of specific documents, but comprehensive architectural documentation isn't permitted. One particular vault holds the personal papers of popes throughout history. Letters, journals, private correspondence never meant for public view. Access requires explicit permission. Only a handful of researchers have been granted entry. Those who have describe sections marked off with chains, cabinets with additional locks beyond the vault's main security, files within files, layers of restriction inside an already restricted space. One researcher mentioned seeing a cabinet labeled reserved astronomical. She assumed it contained historical star charts, papers from Galileo's trial, perhaps. But when she inquired about access, she was told those materials were under permanent seal by papal decree. Not temporary restriction, permanent. The astronomical records are particularly interesting. The Vatican Observatory has existed for centuries. Papal astronomers tracked celestial events, calculated Easter dates, maintained calendars. Those records should form an unbroken chronological sequence. Observations from every year, data from every significant event, comets, eclipses, planetary movements. But gaps exist, years missing. Decades where observations should exist but don't appear in the available archive. A researcher specializing in medieval astronomy requested Vatican observations from specific periods to compare with other European records. Large portions weren't available. Officially explained as lost to water damage or deterioration, but contemporary references mention those exact observations. Other archives cite Vatican data from the missing periods. The documents existed, were used, were referenced, then disappeared. You can see it in the catalog itself. Entries describing materials in detail. Contents, physical condition, storage location. Then, in later catalog updates, those entries marked relocated or undergoing preservation with no return date. Some entries simply vanish between catalog versions. Present in one, absent in the next. No explanation. Not lost. Disappeared.
The simplest explanation is institutional embarrassment. The Catholic Church has endured scandals throughout history, political alliances that look bad in hindsight, financial dealings that seem corrupt by modern standards, decisions that led to suffering. Sealing certain documents protects the Church's reputation. Why release materials that would only fuel criticism? Better to keep them hidden. Let history judge based on what's available, not what's compromising. This theory explains the gaps in Naziara correspondence, the missing Templar financial records, the sealed Inquisition files. Not conspiracy, just institutional self-preservation. For those who remember when the Church denied knowledge of sexual abuse until documents proved otherwise, this explanation fits, but it assumes the sealed materials are merely embarrassing. What if there's something more? The second theory involves forbidden knowledge. Throughout history, the Church has suppressed information deemed dangerous to faith or stability. Heliocentric astronomy, certain interpretations of Scripture, scientific discoveries that contradicted doctrine. The Vatican Archives could contain knowledge the Church decided humanity wasn't ready for, or shouldn't ever know. The missing astronomical records are telling. What did Vatican astronomers observe that required permanent sealing? What celestial phenomena were documented, then hidden? The Church has always maintained the final authority on cosmology, the structure of the heavens, humanity's place in creation. If observations contradicted that narrative, if they suggested something about the universe that the Church couldn't reconcile with doctrine, sealing them makes sense. Not just embarrassment, theological threat. Consider the Templar documents. The official story is that they were heretics, blasphemers. Their destruction was justified. But what if they possessed knowledge? Ancient texts, archaeological discoveries from the Holy Land, information that challenged church teaching. Their wealth came from somewhere. Their power derived from something beyond military skill. What if the missing documents reveal what they actually found, what they actually knew? And what if that knowledge was so dangerous that every trace had to be erased? The astronomical files, the Templar records, the sealed correspondence, all potentially containing information the church decided must never surface. But there's a third possibility that researchers whisper about but rarely write down. What if the archives contain proof of contact? Not political, not theological, contact. The Vatican has one of the world's most advanced astronomical observatories. Papal astronomers have studied the heavens for centuries. They've had technology and resources to observe phenomena that others missed. What if they saw something, documented something, evidence that we're not alone? It sounds absurd, until you remember the Church's history of hiding uncomfortable truths, until you consider the permanent seals on astronomical records spanning centuries. The part they didn't put in textbooks is that the Vatican has consistently been ahead of secular science and astronomy. They had telescopes before most universities. They calculated orbits before modern physics. If anyone was going to observe something anomalous, something that suggested non-human intelligence, it would be papal astronomers with centuries of unbroken observation. And if they did, where would that information go? Into the deepest vaults, the permanent seals, the documents that can never be revealed because they would shatter too many foundational beliefs. Not proof, but enough to get under your skin, enough to make you wonder why astronomical records require papal decree to remain sealed.
It's not about what the Vatican archives contain. It's about what they refuse to show. The 2019 opening was presented as transparency, a new era of openness, access to history long hidden, but researchers who've worked in the archives describe the same pattern. Initial excitement, then frustration. Documents referenced, but unavailable. Collections that should exist, but can't be accessed. The people closest to the archives, the archivists, the preservationists, the senior researchers, don't talk about the deeper restrictions. They deflect. They cite regulations. They explain that some materials require special handling, but you can see it in their faces when certain subjects come up. The sealed vaults, the missing astronomical records, the documents marked forbidden. They know. They've seen the lists. They understand what's being protected. For those who remember when the Church denied the Inquisition's excesses until the archives proved the extent of torture and execution, this pattern is recognizable. Institutions don't seal information to protect the past. They seal it to control the present. What's changed since the 2019 opening? Researchers have published papers based on newly accessible materials, some revelations about papal politics, some insights into historical events. But the major questions remain unanswered, the gaps unexplained, the forbidden documents still forbidden. And the Vatican continues to maintain absolute control over what gets seen, who gets access, what can be photographed or published. They own the history, literally. It sits in their vaults, accessible only through their permission. And what they choose not to show becomes effectively erased from the historical record. Except it isn't erased. It's there, documented, cataloged, sitting on shelves in rooms that researchers aren't allowed to enter. 53 miles of shelving, 12 centuries of accumulated knowledge. The records of an institution that has shaped civilization. And somewhere in those miles, in those centuries, in those vaults beneath Vatican City, sit the documents they decided we shouldn't see. Not lost, not destroyed, hidden. Not because they're too fragile, not because they're too sensitive, but because they're too true.
In 2023, a Vatican archivist leaked a partial inventory list to a historical research forum. The document appeared for less than a day before being removed. The list contained catalog entries for materials marked permanent papal seal, hundreds of documents, collections spanning centuries. One entry referenced astronomical observations inconsistent with accepted cosmology from the 17th century. Another listed Templar correspondence regarding Jerusalem discoveries, with a notation, contents theological impossibility. A third mentioned correspondence with name redacted regarding non-terrestrial contact from the mid-20th century. The thread discussing the leak was deleted. The original poster's account suspended. Researchers who downloaded the inventory found their Vatican access revoked without explanation. A single comment remained before the thread vanished. They've been hiding it for centuries. Why would they stop now?